The frigid Montana winter night of 1878 showed no mercy to Madeline Harris as she huddled in the ramshackle miner's cabin, her slender fingers trembling above the pitiful flame of a half-melted candle. The blizzard outside howled like a pack of hungry wolves, finding every crack in the weathered logs to send its icy breath creeping across the dirt floor. Her provisions had dwindled to nearly nothing, just a handful of beans soaking in a small tin cup, suspended precariously over that tiny, wavering flame. Madeline had never imagined she would end up here, alone in the wilderness, 200 miles from the nearest town of any consequence. 3 weeks ago, she'd been traveling with her uncle's wagon train when the outbreak of influenza had swept through their party. Within days, she was one of only 4 survivors. The others, a family with a sickly child, had pressed on toward Helena, while Madeline, still weak from her own bout with the illness, had chosen to remain behind in this abandoned cabin to regain her strength before continuing her journey. She had expected to stay only a few days. Then the snows came. The wind rattled the door on its leather hinges, and Madeline pulled her threadbare blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her stomach clenched with hunger as she stared at the pitiful meal warming over the candle. She'd been rationing her food for days, hoping the weather would break, but the storm showed no signs of relenting. The sudden pounding at the door nearly stopped her heart. "Hello, the cabin," a deep voice called over the shriek of the wind. "Anyone alive in there?" Madeline froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the small Derringer pistol her father had given her before she'd left St. Louis. Visitors in this remote wilderness were rare and not always welcome. "Who's there?" she called, trying to keep her voice steady. "Name's Wade Blackwood, madam." "I've got 3 men with me. We're caught in this storm and saw your light. We're half frozen and could use shelter if you've got room to spare." Madeline hesitated. The cabin was small, barely 12 feet square, but the alternative was leaving fellow humans to the mercy of the blizzard. Clutching the Derringer in her pocket, she moved to the door and lifted the crude wooden bar. The door burst open with a gust of snow and wind, and 4 snow-covered figures stumbled inside. The last man quickly closed the door behind them, shutting out the howling storm. As they stamped snow from their boots and removed their ice-encrusted hats, Madeline stepped back, her hand still firmly gripping the pistol in her pocket. The tallest of the men stepped forward, removing a frost-covered scarf from his face. Even in the dim candlelight, Madeline could see he was handsome, with a strong jaw darkened by several days' growth of beard and eyes the color of a summer sky. He swept off his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. "Madam," he said, nodding respectfully, "Wade Blackwood." "These are my companions Tom Winters, Jack Farley, and Hank Morrison. We're drovers, caught in this storm while moving cattle to Fort Benton." "Madeline Harris," she replied, nodding cautiously. "I'm afraid I don't have much to offer in the way of hospitality." Wade's eyes drifted to the small flame of her candle and the meager meal heating above it. His expression softened with understanding and perhaps a touch of sympathy. "She was cooking over a candle," he said quietly to his companions, then turned back to her. "Come where there's fire enough for all, Miss Harris. We've got supplies on our pack horses and know how to build a proper fire even in this weather." Within an hour, the cabin had been transformed. The men had brought in armloads of firewood from their supplies, and a cheerful fire now blazed in the small stone fireplace that Madeline had been unable to fuel properly by herself. Wade had produced coffee, jerky, and even a small sack of flour from their packs, and the enticing aroma of coffee now mingled with the scent of frying salt pork. Madeline sat close to the fire, a tin cup of hot coffee warming her hands. For the first time in weeks, she felt the tight knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen. "How long have you been here alone, Miss Harris?" Wade asked, handing her a plate with fried salt pork and a small biscuit he'd somehow managed to bake in the fireplace. "Nearly 3 weeks," she replied, trying not to appear too eager as she accepted the food. "I was traveling with my uncle's party to Helena when sickness hit our camp. My uncle and most of the others died. I was still recovering when the first snow fell." Wade nodded grimly. That's a hard piece of luck. Where were you heading in Helena? My uncle had a small mercantile there. I was going to help him run it, but now. She trailed off, the reality of her situation settling heavily on her shoulders once again. Do you have other family there? Tom asked from where he sat by the door. Madeline shook her head. No, my parents died in St. Louis 2 years ago. My uncle was my only remaining family. The men exchanged glances, and Madeline could read the concern in their expressions. A woman alone in the Montana Territory had few options, none of them particularly promising. Well, Wade said finally, breaking the uncomfortable silence, this storm isn't going anywhere tonight. We'll stay put, get some rest, and figure things out in the morning. With your permission, of course, Miss Harris. You're welcome to stay, Madeline replied softly. I'd be a poor Christian indeed if I turned you away in this weather, especially after you've shared your provisions so generously. As the others prepared for sleep, arranging their bedrolls on the floor of the small cabin, Wade remained by the fire, adding another log and stirring the embers. Madeline watched him surreptitiously from her place near the wall. There was something compelling about the man, a quiet confidence that she found reassuring. You should get some sleep, Miss Harris, he said without turning around. Tomorrow will be another long day. Mr. Blackwood, she said hesitantly, thank you for the food and the fire. He turned then, and in the firelight his smile was warm and genuine. No need for thanks. Out here we all have to look after each other. Now get some rest. As Madeline settled into her makeshift bed, she realized that for the first time in weeks she didn't feel afraid. With the fire crackling cheerfully and the reassuring presence of Wade and his men, she felt improbably safe. Outside, the blizzard continued to rage, but inside the tiny cabin, warmth had finally returned. The storm showed no signs of abating the next morning. Madeline awoke to the sound of quiet conversation and the rich aroma of coffee. Opening her eyes, she saw Wade and his men gathered around the fire, speaking in low tones that ceased when they noticed she was awake. Good morning, Miss Harris, Wade said, rising to his feet. I hope we didn't disturb your rest. Not at all, she replied, quickly straightening her hair and dress as best she could. I've slept later than usual. Best thing for you, Tom commented, pouring a cup of coffee and offering it to her. You look like you could use the rest. Madeline accepted the coffee gratefully. What's the weather like? She asked, though she could still hear the wind howling outside. No better, Wade replied grimly. And from the look of those clouds, we're in for at least another day or two of this. We've been discussing our options. Options? Madeline asked, taking a careful sip of the hot coffee. Wade nodded, his expression serious. The way I see it, we've got a few choices, none of them ideal. We can try to press on to Fort Benton, but in this weather, that would be foolhardy at best, suicidal at worst. We could split up, suggested Hank, a stocky man with a thick mustache. Some stay here, some try to make it to the fort for help. Wade shook his head firmly. No, we stay together, which leaves us with the third option. We all remain here until the storm breaks. I couldn't ask you to delay your journey on my account, Madeline protested. It's not just on your account, Miss Harris, Wade said kindly. The cattle are sheltered in a small canyon about a mile back. They've got some protection from the wind there and enough grazing to last a few days. Pushing them through this blizzard would cost us half the herd, at least. I see, Madeline said, relieved that she wouldn't be left alone again, but concerned about the strain her presence put on their supplies. I don't wish to be a burden on your provisions. No burden at all, Jack said with a friendly smile. Wade here's the best hunter in Montana Territory. Storm or no storm, he'll keep us fed. Wade shot his friend an exasperated look. Don't go making promises my rifle might not be able to keep, Jack. He turned back to Madeline. But we do have enough supplies for several days, Miss Harris, and if the storm breaks, I might be able to find some game. Please call me Madeline, she said impulsively. If we're to be storm-bound together, there's no need for such formality. A hint of a smile touched Wade's lips. Madeline, then. They settled into a routine over the next 2 days. The men took turns checking on the cattle, always going in pairs for safety. When in the cabin, they made repairs that Madeline had been unable to manage on her own, fixing the leaky roof. properly chinking the gaps between logs to keep out the biting wind, and reinforcing the door and shutters. Wade proved to be a man of unexpected talents. On the afternoon of the second day, when the storm briefly abated, he indeed returned with a young deer slung over his shoulder, providing them with fresh meat. He also fashioned a crude broom from pine branches so Madeline could sweep the dirt floor, and whittled a set of checkers from pieces of firewood so they would have some entertainment during the long evenings. Madeline found herself drawn to the quiet cowboy. Unlike his more talkative companions, Wade spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. He treated her with unfailing courtesy, always ensuring she had the warmest spot by the fire and the first serving of food. Yet there was never a hint of condescension in his manner, just a natural protectiveness that Madeline found both reassuring and strangely stirring. On the third night, after Tom, Jack, and Hank had fallen asleep, Madeline remained awake, staring into the fire. Wade sat across from her, his hands busy with a piece of leather he was fashioning into a new strap for his saddle. "You should try to sleep," he said softly, not looking up from his work. "I'm not tired," she replied. Then, after a moment's hesitation, "Mr. Blackwood, Wade, may I ask you something?" He glanced up, his blue eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "Of course. What will happen when the storm breaks? To me, I mean." Wade's hands stilled. "What would you like to happen, Madeline?" She looked down at her hands, twisted together in her lap. "I don't know. I have no family left, no home to return to. I was going to Helena to help my uncle, but now—" "You have skills," Wade said matter-of-factly. "I've watched you these past days. You're resourceful, adaptable. Those are valuable traits out here, for a woman alone." Madeline asked with a touch of bitterness. Wade set aside his leatherwork and leaned forward, his expression serious. "The territory's a hard place, no denying that, especially for a woman on her own, but there are possibilities. Such as Fort Benton's growing. They've got need of school teachers, seamstresses. Or," he hesitated, "you could consider continuing to Helena as you planned. Your uncle's mercantile, was there any arrangement made for its disposition in case of his death?" Madeline looked surprised. I don't know. He had a partner, I believe." "A Mr. Collins, but I've never met the man." "Then that might be your first course of action," Wade suggested. "Go to Helena, speak with this Collins fellow, see what opportunities might exist. And how would I get there? I have no horse, no wagon." Wade's eyes held hers steadily. "We're driving cattle to Fort Benton. From there, it's a relatively easy journey to Helena by stagecoach. You could travel with us to the fort." Hope flickered in Madeline's heart for the first time in weeks. "You would do that. Take me with you." "We would," Wade confirmed. "Though I should warn you, traveling with a cattle drive isn't exactly comfortable, especially for a lady." A small smile touched Madeline's lips. "Mr. Blackwood, I've survived 3 weeks alone in a blizzard with nothing but a candle for warmth and a handful of beans for sustenance. I believe I can manage a cattle drive." For the first time since they'd met, Wade laughed, a rich, warm sound that seemed to fill the small cabin. "I don't doubt it for a moment, Miss Harris, not for a single moment." The storm finally broke on the 5th day, leaving behind a world transformed by glistening white. The sky dawned clear and brilliantly blue, the sun reflecting off the snow with almost blinding intensity. The temperature remained bitterly cold, but without the wind, it felt almost pleasant after the howling fury of the blizzard. Wade and his men set about preparing for departure, checking their gear and assessing the condition of their horses. Madeline had few possessions to pack, just a small bundle of clothing, her father's derringer, a locket containing miniature portraits of her parents, and a well-worn Bible. "We'll need to fashion some kind of mount for you," Wade said, studying her thoughtfully. "None of our horses is suitable for a side saddle, I'm afraid." "I don't ride side saddle," Madeline replied, drawing surprised looks from all 4 men. At their expressions, she explained, "My father believed that a woman should know how to ride properly if she was to survive in the West. He taught me to ride astride when I was just a girl." Wade's eyes crinkled with amusement. "Well, that simplifies matters. Tom's pack horse is gentle enough. We'll redistribute the load and saddle him for you." By mid-morning, they were ready to depart. Madeline took one last look around the small cabin that had been both her prison and her sanctuary for nearly a month. Despite its crude amenities and the hardships she had endured there, she felt an unexpected pang at leaving it behind. "It saved your life," Wade said quietly, seeming to read her thoughts. "That's no small thing," Madeline nodded. "Yes, though I'm not sure I would have survived much longer without your arrival." Wade helped her mount the sturdy bay gelding they had prepared for her. His hands were strong and sure as he adjusted the stirrups to fit her shorter legs. "Ready?" he asked, looking up at her. Madeline took a deep breath of the crisp winter air. "Ready." The journey to where the cattle were sheltered took about an hour through the deep snow. When they arrived, Madeline was surprised to see nearly 200 head of cattle huddled in a natural basin protected by steep rock walls on 3 sides. "Their trail hardened," Wade explained as they surveyed the herd, "and fortunate. This canyon provided good shelter from the worst of the storm." The cattle were indeed in remarkably good condition, having found enough winter graze under the snow to sustain them. After allowing the animals to drink from a small stream that ran through the canyon, Wade and his men began the process of moving them out onto the trail. Madeline quickly discovered that cattle driving was nothing like the orderly processions she had imagined. It was chaotic, dusty work, with constant movement required to keep the animals together and moving in the right direction. Despite her claims of resilience, by mid-afternoon her muscles were aching from the unaccustomed hours in the saddle, and her face was chapped from the cold wind. Wade noticed her discomfort and called a halt in a sheltered grove of pines. "We'll make camp here for the night," he announced. "There's good grazing for the cattle in that meadow yonder, and these trees will break the wind." As the men set about establishing their camp with practiced efficiency, Madeline attempted to dismount. Her legs, stiff from the cold and the long hours of riding, buckled beneath her. Before she could fall, strong hands caught her around the waist. "Easy there," Wade said, setting her gently on her feet. "First day's always the hardest." Madeline winced as she tried to straighten. "I fear I'm not as trail-hardened as your cattle, Mr. Blackwood." A smile touched his lips. "Few are, Miss Harris, few are." That evening, as they sat around the campfire after a simple meal of beans, bacon, and coffee, Madeline found herself studying Wade covertly. In the 5 days they had shared the cabin, she had come to respect his quiet competence and natural leadership. Today, watching him work with the cattle and his men, that respect had deepened. He was not a man given to unnecessary words or gestures. Everything he did served a purpose. Yet there was a gentleness to him that belied his rugged exterior. She had seen it in the way he handled his horse, in his patience with the cattle, and in his unfailing courtesy toward her. "Penny for your thoughts, Miss Harris," Tom said, breaking into her reverie. Madeline flushed, hoping the firelight concealed her embarrassment at being caught staring. "I was just thinking how different this is from what I expected when I left St. Louis. Life out here has a way of appending expectations," Wade commented, pouring himself another cup of coffee. "What brought you west in the first place? Most young ladies of your obvious refinement prefer to remain in civilization." Madeline gazed into the fire, considering her answer. "After my parents died, there was little left for me in St. Louis. My father's business partners took advantage of my inexperience to claim the majority of his assets, leaving me with barely enough to survive. When my uncle wrote offering me a place in his home and business, it seemed like providence." "And now?" Wade asked quietly. Madeline lifted her chin. "Now I shall have to make my own way, as so many others have done before me. I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Blackwood. My father may have raised me as a lady, but he also raised me to be practical." Wade nodded, his expression thoughtful. "The territory needs practical people, especially those who can adapt to its particular challenges." The conversation turned to other topics than the weather, the condition of the trail ahead, stories of previous cattle drives. Madeline listened, absorbing the camaraderie of these men who had welcomed her so readily into their company. For the first time since her uncle's death, she felt a cautious optimism about her future. Later, as she lay wrapped in blankets near the fire, sleep eluding her despite her physical exhaustion, she heard Wade speaking quietly to Tom a short distance away. "Needs to reach Helena," Wade was saying. "I've been thinking we might split the herd. You, Jack, and Hank take the main group on to Fort Benton as planned. I'll drive a smaller bunch to Helena along with Miss Harris." "That's a long detour, Wade," Tom replied, "and risky with just the two of you." "I know, but she's got nowhere else to go, Tom, and something tells me she deserves a fair chance at making a new start." "Something or someone?" Tom asked, a teasing note in his voice. There was a pause before Wade answered, his voice gruff. "Don't start with that nonsense. The lady's been through enough without adding complications." "If you say so," Tom replied, clearly unconvinced. "But I've known you 15 years, Wade Blackwood, and I've never seen you go so far out of your way for anyone before, man or woman." Madeline closed her eyes quickly as Wade turned toward the fire, pretending to be asleep. But long after the camp had grown quiet, she lay awake, Wade's words repeating in her mind. He was willing to delay his own journey, potentially risk profits and even safety to see her safely to Helena. Why would he do such a thing for a woman he had known less than a week? And why did the thought of spending more time in his company make her heart beat faster? The next 4 days established a pattern. They would rise before dawn, eat a quick breakfast of coffee and hardtack, then begin moving the herd as soon as there was light enough to see. The weather remained clear but bitterly cold, with temperatures well below freezing most days. Madeline grew more comfortable with her role in the drive. While she lacked the skills to help with the actual herding, she took over camp duties, preparing meals, tending the fire, and keeping watch over their supplies when the men were busy with the cattle. Her muscles gradually adjusted to the daily riding, and though she was exhausted each night, it was the satisfying weariness of honest work rather than the desperate fatigue of her time alone in the cabin. Wade remained a puzzle to her. Since overhearing his conversation with Tom, she had watched him more closely, looking for some indication of his true feelings. But the cowboy kept his thoughts well guarded. He was unfailingly polite, ensuring her comfort and safety at every turn, but maintaining a careful distance that left Madeline both relieved and oddly disappointed. On the afternoon of the 5th day, they reached a fork in the trail. The path to the left continued northward toward Fort Benton, while the right fork turned west toward Helena. "This is where we part ways," Wade announced, dismounting from his horse. The men gathered around as he explained his plan to split the herd. Tom, Jack, and Hank would continue with the majority of the cattle to Fort Benton as originally contracted. Wade would take 30 head and escort Madeline to Helena, where he had another buyer interested in purchasing stock. "It's a 2-week journey to Helena from here," Wade concluded. "I should be able to rejoin you in Fort Benton by early April, assuming the weather holds." The men exchanged glances, and Madeline could see their concern. "That's cutting it close for the spring drive, Wade," Jack pointed out. "And traveling with just the two of you, I've made my decision," Wade said firmly. "Miss Harris needs to reach Helena, and I gave my word that we would see her safely there." "I never asked for such a sacrifice," Madeline interjected, dismayed at the thought of causing disruption to their plans. "I could continue with all of you to Fort Benton and take the stage from there," Wade shook his head. "The stage route from Fort Benton to Helena this time of year is unreliable at best. Besides, I have legitimate business in Helena myself." He turned back to his men. "We'll separate the cattle now. Make camp here tonight and head out in different directions come morning." Though clearly not entirely satisfied with the arrangement, Tom, Jack, and Hank set about the task of separating 30 head from the main herd. By nightfall, 2 distinct groups of cattle grazed a short distance apart, and the men gathered around the fire for their last meal together. The mood was subdued. These men had worked together for years, Madeline realized, and separating, even temporarily, was not done lightly. She felt a weight of responsibility knowing that her presence was partly the cause of this disruption. After the meal, as the others prepared for sleep, Madeline approached Wade where he sat checking his rifle by the firelight. "Mr. Blackwood," she said quietly, I want you to know that I appreciate what you're doing, but I never intended for you to go so far out of your way on my account." Wade looked up, his blue eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "It's not entirely on your account, Miss Harris. I do have business in Helena." "Business that conveniently arose just when I needed to go there?" Madeline asked skeptically. A ghost of a smile touched Wade's lips. "You're more perceptive than I gave you credit for." "Why?" she pressed. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Wade set his rifle aside and stood, towering over her in the firelight. "Are we still strangers, Madeline? After sharing a 12-foot cabin for 5 days and a trail for 5 more, the use of her given name sent an unexpected warmth through her. "No," she admitted. "I suppose we're not strangers anymore." "No," he agreed softly. "We're not." He hesitated, then added, "When I found you in that cabin, cooking beans over a candle flame, I've seen many things in my years on the frontier, but I've rarely seen such courage." "It wasn't courage," Madeline protested. "It was desperation." "Many people despair in desperate circumstances," Wade replied. "Few manage to survive them with the grace you've shown." Madeline felt her cheeks warm at the unexpected compliment. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Wade nodded once, then turned back to his rifle. "We have an early start tomorrow. You should get some rest." As Madeline settled into her blankets, she found herself looking forward to the journey ahead with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. 2 weeks alone on the trail with Wade Blackwood, a man who was rapidly becoming far more important to her than a mere traveling companion should be. Dawn broke clear and cold, the sky a pale lavender fading to gold at the eastern horizon. After a quick breakfast, the time came for the group to separate. Tom, Jack, and Hank each shook Madeline's hand, wishing her well on her journey and extracting a promise from Wade to meet them in Fort Benton by the first week of April. "Don't you worry about this old wolf," Tom told Madeline with a wink. "He knows these hills better than most Indians. He'll see you safely to Helena." "Take care of him too," Jack added more seriously. "He's got a habit of looking after everyone but himself." With final farewells exchanged, the two groups set off in opposite directions, Tom, Jack, and Hank driving the main herd northward toward Fort Benton, while Wade and Madeline headed west with their smaller group of cattle. The dynamics of the drive changed immediately. With only 2 of them to manage 30 head, both had to be constantly vigilant. Wade taught Madeline the basics of herding, how to position herself to keep the cattle moving in the right direction, how to use her voice and presence to guide them, when to press forward and when to hold back. She proved to be a quick study, her natural affinity for horses translating well to handling cattle. By midday, they had settled into an efficient rhythm, with Wade taking the lead position and Madeline riding flank, keeping the small herd bunched and moving steadily westward. "You're a natural," Wade commented during a brief rest to water the cattle at a small stream. "Most city folk take weeks to develop the instincts you've shown in a single morning." Madeline smiled, pleased by his approval. "My father believed in practical education. He may have kept a fine house in St. Louis, but he made sure I knew how to ride, shoot, and even mend harnesses." "A forward-thinking man," Wade observed. "He was," Madeline agreed, a shadow of sadness crossing her face. "He would have thrived out here, I think. He always spoke of moving west when he retired. He never got the chance." "But you're here," Wade said quietly, "carrying on that dream in your own way." Madeline looked at him in surprise. She had never thought of her journey west in those terms, but there was truth in his words. "Yes," she said slowly, "I suppose I am." They made good progress that first day, covering nearly 15 miles before making camp in a protected valley as the sun began to set. Without the additional hands, setting up camp took longer, and Madeline found herself taking on tasks she had previously left to the men gathering firewood, helping to stake out the horses, even assisting Wade in erecting a small canvas shelter to protect them from the night dew. After a simple dinner of beans, bacon, and the last of the venison jerky, they sat by the fire, the cattle settled nearby for the night. The silence between them felt different now, more intimate somehow, without the buffer of other companions. "How far is it to Helena from here?" Madeline asked, partly to break the silence and partly out of genuine curiosity. About 150 miles as the crow flies, Wade replied. Longer by trail, especially with cattle. We'll need to follow the gentler grades, avoid the worst of the mountain passes. 2 weeks, you said. Wade nodded, give or take a few days depending on weather and trail conditions. He studied her across the fire. Are you having second thoughts about the journey? No, Madeline said quickly. Not at all. I was just thinking about what awaits me there. Your uncle's partner, Wade recalled. Collins, was it? Yes, though I have no idea if he'll welcome my appearance or consider me an unwelcome complication. Wade prodded the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward into the night sky. What will you do if he's less than welcoming? Madeline had asked herself the same question many times over the past weeks. I'll find work, she said with more confidence than she felt. As you said, there are always positions for teachers or seamstresses. I'm well educated and capable with a needle. You're more than capable, Wade commented. You're remarkable. The simple compliment, delivered in his matter-of-fact tone, warmed Madeline more than the fire before her. You barely know me, Mr. Blackwood. I know enough, he replied, his blue eyes reflecting the flames as he looked at her steadily. I know you survived alone in a blizzard when many experienced frontiersmen would have perished. I know you've adapted to trail life with more grace than most men I've hired. And I know you face an uncertain future with courage instead of fear. Madeline looked away, uncomfortable with his praise yet strangely moved by it. You give me too much credit. I've had my share of fears and doubts. Having fear isn't the same as being ruled by it, Wade said quietly. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's moving forward despite it. They lapsed into silence again, but it was a comfortable one, each lost in their own thoughts as the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead in the vast Montana sky. The next morning dawned overcast, with a biting wind that hinted at more snow to come. They broke camp quickly and set the cattle moving before the weather could worsen. By mid-morning, light flakes had begun to fall, swirling in the wind. There's a line shack about 10 miles ahead, Wade told Madeline as they rode. Used by the big ranches during summer grazing, if we push hard, we can reach it before the worst of this storm hits. They urged the cattle to a faster pace, driving them steadily through the increasing snowfall. The temperature dropped throughout the day, and by early afternoon, the snow was falling heavily, limiting visibility to less than 100 yards. There, Wade shouted over the wind, pointing to a dark shape barely visible through the swirling white. The line shack. It was a crude structure, little more than a one-room cabin with a small attached corral, but to Madeline, cold and exhausted from fighting the elements all day, it looked like salvation. They drove the cattle into the corral, then quickly unsaddled their horses and brought their gear inside. The interior of the shack was Spartan but sound a dirt floor, a small stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 stools, and a narrow cot in one corner. Wade immediately set about building a fire while Madeline cared for their horses, rubbing them down and providing them with the meager shelter of a lean-to attach to the cabin. By the time she returned, stamping snow from her boots, Wade had a cheerful fire blazing in the fireplace. The small cabin was already warming, the thick log walls holding in the heat far better than the canvas shelter they had used the previous night. The cattle, Madeline asked, moving to warm her hands by the fire. They'll be fine in the corral, Wade assured her. There's enough shelter from the wind and they'll bunch together for warmth. It's us I'm concerned about. The cabin seems sturdy enough, Madeline said, looking around at their temporary shelter. It is, Wade agreed, but it's also small, very small. For the first time, Madeline fully registered the implications of their situation. 1 room, 1 cot, the 2 of them alone, potentially for several days if the storm lasted. Wade seemed to read her thoughts. I'll sleep by the fire, he said firmly. You take the cot. I couldn't possibly. You can and you will, Wade interrupted gently. I've slept on harder ground in worse conditions many times, Miss Harris. 1 night or 2 on a dirt floor won't trouble me. His use of her formal name seemed deliberate, a reminder of the propriety he intended to maintain despite their intimate circumstances. Madeline nodded, grateful for his consideration of her reputation, even here where there was no one to observe them. The storm raged through the night and into the next day, confining them to the small cabin. They passed the time with conversation, Wade sharing stories of his years as a drover and rancher, Madeline speaking of her life in St. Louis and her journey west with her uncle's party. By the second day of their confinement, a comfortable familiarity had developed between them. Wade had begun calling her Madeline again, and she found herself using his given name with increasing ease. They worked together in the small space with the synchronicity of longtime companions preparing meals, tending the fire, caring for the horses and cattle during brief breaks in the storm. On the evening of the second day, as they sat by the fire after a simple dinner of biscuits and beans, Wade surprised Madeline by asking a question he had thus far avoided. Was there someone waiting for you in St. Louis, someone you left behind? Madeline looked up from her mending. She was repairing a tear in Wade's heavy wool coat with surprise. No, she said after a moment. There was no one. I find that hard to believe, Wade commented, his voice carefully neutral as he cleaned his pistol by the firelight. A young woman of your qualities would have had no shortage of suitors. A small smile touched Madeline's lips. There were a few gentlemen who called upon me, yes, but after my parents died and my circumstances changed. She shrugged slightly. It's remarkable how quickly a lady's appeal diminishes when her fortune does. Wade's hands stilled, his expression darkening. Then they were fools, every one of them. The vehemence in his voice startled her. It's the way of the world, Mr. Blackwood. Men seek advantageous matches, just as women do. Not all men, Wade said quietly, returning his attention to his pistol. Some value qualities that can't be measured in dollars or property. And you, Madeline asked, emboldened by the intimacy of their situation. Have you never sought an advantageous match? A shadow passed over Wade's face. I was married once, he said after a long pause. Many years ago when I was little more than a boy. She died in childbirth along with our son. Oh, Wade, Madeline breathed, setting aside her mending. I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have pried, he shook his head slightly. It was a long time ago, 17 years this spring, and you never remarried. No. He reassembled his pistol with practiced movements. The life I've chosen, constant movement, uncertain prospects, it's not conducive to family life, and I never met another woman who. He trailed off, then finished simply, it never seemed right. The unspoken words hung in the air between them. Madeline returned to her mending, but her mind was filled with thoughts of this complex man who had come into her life so unexpectedly. A man who had known deep loss yet retained the capacity for kindness. A man who lived by a code of honor that seemed increasingly rare in the world she had known. The storm finally broke on the third day, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white drifts and crystal-clear skies. They set out at first light, eager to make up for lost time. The cattle, restless after their confinement, moved with surprising energy, and by nightfall they had covered nearly 20 miles. The days that followed settled into a pattern. They would rise before dawn, breakfast quickly, and set the herd moving as soon as there was light enough to see. Wade proved to be an excellent teacher, patiently showing Madeline the finer points of cattle driving and prairie navigation. She, in turn, surprised him with her quick learning and willingness to take on any task, no matter how difficult or unpleasant. Evenings around the campfire became a cherished time for both of them. As their journey progressed, the initial reserve between them gradually dissolved, replaced by a comfortable companionship that felt increasingly natural. They spoke of books they had read, places they had seen, dreams they had harbored. Wade revealed a depth of knowledge and thoughtfulness that belied his rough exterior, while Madeline displayed a practical wisdom and resilience that impressed the experienced frontiersman. 10 days into their journey, they crested a rise to see the distant outline of mountains against the western sky. The Helena Valley lies just beyond those foothills, Wade said, pointing to the purple shadows on the horizon. We should reach town in 2 days, 3 at most. Madeline felt a sudden, unexpected pang at his words. Their journey was nearing its end. Soon they would reach Helena, and Wade would continue on to Fort Benton to rejoin his companions. The thought left her with a hollow feeling she was reluctant to examine too closely. "What will you do?" she asked. "After you deliver the cattle in Helena," Wade's eyes remained fixed on the distant mountains. "Continue on to Fort Benton as planned. We have contracts for a spring drive that need finalizing." "I see," Madeline said, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. What had she expected? That he would abandon his livelihood, his partners, to remain in Helena? The very idea was absurd. "And you?" Wade asked, turning to look at her. "What will you do once we reach town?" Madeline squared her shoulders. "Find Mr. Collins. Learn what I can about my uncle's business arrangements, and then make a new life for myself however I can." Wade studied her face for a long moment. "You'll succeed," he said finally. "You have the strength for it." "Thank you," Madeline replied softly, "for your confidence. And for everything else." They made camp early that evening in a sheltered valley with good grazing for the cattle. After dinner, as they sat by the fire, Wade surprised Madeline by producing a small flask from his saddlebags. "I've been saving this," he said, uncorking the flask and offering it to her. "Seems like a good night for it, with Helena almost in sight." Madeline hesitated, then accepted the flask, taking a small sip. The whiskey burned pleasantly down her throat, warming her from within. "What are we celebrating?" she asked, passing the flask back to him. Wade took a drink before answering. "The end of a successful journey and perhaps new beginnings." "New beginnings," Madeline echoed softly. "I'll drink to that." They passed the flask back and forth several times, the whiskey loosening the final threads of reserve between them. Wade spoke of his childhood in Tennessee, his journey west after the war, the years of building his reputation as a reliable drover. Madeline shared memories of her parents, her education at a ladies' seminary in Philadelphia, her dreams of someday having a home and family of her own. "It's strange," she said, gazing into the fire. "A month ago, I thought my life was over. Stranded in that cabin, watching my supplies dwindle, I couldn't see any future at all. And now?" "And now?" Wade prompted when she fell silent. Madeline looked up, meeting his eyes across the flames. "Now I can imagine possibilities again. Whatever happens in Helena, I know I can face it." "You've shown me that. You always had that strength, Madeline," Wade said quietly. "I just reminded you of it." The firelight illuminated his face, casting shadows that emphasized the strong planes of his jaw and cheekbones. In that moment, Madeline was struck by how handsome he was, not in the polished way of the St. Louis gentleman who had once courted her, but with a rugged authenticity that spoke of a life lived on his own terms. "Wade," she began, then hesitated, uncertain how to express the tumult of emotions she was feeling. He set the flask aside and rose, moving around the fire to sit beside her on the fallen log she had claimed as a seat. "Yes," he asked, his voice low. "I." Madeline faltered, then gathered her courage. "I'm grateful for these days we've shared, more grateful than I can express." Wade's eyes held hers, the blue darkened to midnight in the dim light. "Is gratitude all you feel, Madeline?" Her heart quickened at the question. "No," she admitted softly. "Not only gratitude." Wade lifted a hand to her face, his calloused fingers gentle as they traced the line of her cheek. "What else?" he murmured. "I think you know," Madeline whispered. "I need to hear you say it." Madeline took a deep breath. "I care for you, Wade. Far more than I should, given the brevity of our acquaintance." A smile touched his lips. "Time is measured differently out here. Days on the trail can reveal more of a person's character than years in drawing rooms." "Perhaps," Madeline agreed. "But that doesn't change the fact that our paths will soon diverge. You to Fort Benton, me to whatever awaits in Helena." Wade's hand dropped from her face and he turned to look into the fire. "Yes," he said after a moment, "that's true." They sat in silence for a time, the crackling of the fire and the occasional lowing of the cattle the only sounds in the vast stillness of the Montana night. "We should get some rest," Wade said finally, rising to his feet. "Morning comes early." Madeline nodded, disappointment a cold weight in her chest. She had revealed too much, pushed too far. Now their final days together would be awkward, the easy companionship they had developed strained by her ill-considered confession. But as she moved to her bedroll, Wade caught her hand, stopping her. When she looked up at him questioningly, he said simply, "I care for you too, Madeline, more than I've cared for anyone in a very long time." Before she could respond, he released her hand and turned away, moving to his own bedroll on the opposite side of the fire. Madeline stood motionless for a moment, his words echoing in her mind. Then, with a small smile, she settled into her blankets for the night. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight she would sleep with hope in her heart. The next day dawned clear and cold, the rising sun painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. They broke camp quickly, both of them a little shy after the previous evening's exchange, but the demands of the trail soon restored their usual comfortable rhythm. By mid-afternoon, they had reached the foothills of the mountains that guarded the Helena Valley. The trail narrowed, winding upward through stands of pine and spruce. The cattle moved more slowly on the steeper terrain, requiring constant attention to keep them from straying. "There's a good camping spot about 2 miles ahead," Wade said as they paused to rest the herd. "A small meadow with a spring. We'll stop there for the night. Tomorrow we'll cross the pass and start down into the valley. With luck, we'll reach Helena by sunset." Madeline nodded, pushing away the pang of regret that came with the reminder of their journey's imminent end. "How many cattle drives have you led to Helena?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. 3 or 4, Wade replied. "It's not on our usual route, but we've had buyers there in the past." "And this buyer now, he's expecting you," Wade hesitated just a fraction too long before answering. "He knows I might be coming this way." Madeline gave him a sharp look. "Might be. Wade, did you arrange this buyer specifically for this journey?" Wade's expression remained impassive, but a slight flush colored his cheekbones. "Would it matter if I had?" "Of course it would matter." "You led me to believe you had legitimate business in Helena." "I do have legitimate business," Wade countered. "Selling cattle is my business, and there's always a market for good stock in a growing town like Helena." Madeline stared at him, torn between irritation at his deception and a warm glow at the implication behind it. "You diverted your entire drive, split your herd, and delayed your return to Fort Benton just to escort me to Helena." Wade met her gaze steadily. "Yes." The simple affirmation left Madeline momentarily speechless. Before she could gather her thoughts to respond, a gunshot cracked through the mountain air, followed immediately by a second. Wade was in motion instantly, spurring his horse toward her. "Get down," he shouted, drawing his pistol. Madeline barely had time to register his warning before a third shot rang out. Wade's horse screamed and reared, throwing him from the saddle. He landed hard, rolling to his feet with remarkable agility, his gun still in his hand. "Rustlers." He called to her, gesturing urgently for her to dismount. "Get to cover." Madeline slid from her horse and darted to a cluster of boulders a few yards off the trail, leading her nervous mount with her. The cattle, panicked by the gunfire, were scattering in all directions despite their earlier fatigue. From her position behind the rocks, Madeline could see 3 riders emerging from the tree line, firing as they came. Wade took cover behind a fallen log, returning fire with careful precision. One of the attackers fell from his saddle, but the other 2 continued their approach, splitting to flank Wade's position. Madeline reached into her pocket, fingers closing around her father's derringer. It was a small weapon, effective only at close range, but it was better than nothing. She waited, heart pounding, as one of the rustlers crept closer to Wade's position, clearly intending to catch him in a crossfire. When the man was within 20 feet of her hiding place, Madeline stepped out, raised the derringer, and fired. Her shot caught the rustler in the shoulder, spinning him around. He dropped his rifle, clutching at the wound with a howl of pain and surprise. Wade seized the opportunity, breaking from cover to tackle the injured man. They went down in a tangle of limbs, struggling for control. The third rustler turned his attention to this new threat, raising his rifle to fire at Wade's exposed back. Without thinking, Madeline threw a rock at the man, the small projectile striking him in the side of the head. It wasn't enough to injure him, but the unexpected attack startled him, causing his shot to go wide. Before he could recover, Wade's gun barked once, and the final attacker crumpled to the ground. The sudden silence was almost deafening after the chaos of the gunfight. Madeline stood frozen, the empty derringer still clutched in her hand, as Wade quickly bound the wounded rustler with a length of rope from his saddle. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, crossing to her once the man was secured. Madeline shook her head, unable to find her voice. Now that the danger had passed, she was shaking uncontrollably, the reality of what had just happened crashing over her in waves. Wade holstered his pistol and took her gently by the shoulders. "Breathe, Madeline," he instructed softly. "Just breathe, it's over now." She drew a shuddering breath, then another. "I shot him," she whispered. "I actually shot a man. You saved my life," Wade corrected her. "If you hadn't acted when you did, they would have had me in a crossfire. I wouldn't have stood a chance." The enormity of it all, the attack, her response, the men lying dead or wounded on the trail, suddenly overwhelmed her. Madeline's knees buckled, and she would have fallen if Wade hadn't caught her, pulling her against his chest in a protective embrace. "It's all right," he murmured into her hair. "You're safe, we're both safe." She clung to him, drawing strength from his solid presence. After a few moments, her trembling subsided, and she stepped back, composing herself with an effort of will. "What happens now?" she asked, looking at the bound rustler and then at the scattered cattle visible through the trees. Wade's expression hardened as he glanced at their prisoner. "Now we round up the cattle, make camp, and in the morning we take this scum to the authorities in Helena." He looked at Madeline with concern. "Can you help with the herd? I don't want to leave you alone with him." Madeline straightened her shoulders, determination replacing the last traces of shock. "I can manage the herd, you secure our guest." It took nearly 2 hours to recover most of the scattered cattle. A few had fled too far into the woods to be easily found, but Wade assured Madeline they would likely rejoin the herd overnight, drawn by the familiar presence of their fellows. They made camp in the meadow Wade had mentioned, though the events of the day had cast a pall over what should have been a pleasant sight. The rustler, who refused to give his name, sat bound to a tree at the edge of their camp, sullenly watching their preparations. "What will happen to him?" Madeline asked quietly as they ate a simple dinner of hardtack and dried beef, too exhausted from the day's events to prepare a proper meal. "He'll hang, most likely," Wade replied matter-of-factly. "Cattle rustling is a hanging offense in the territory. If he's lucky, he might get prison instead, but given that his partners were killed in the attempt, the law won't be inclined to leniency." Madeline glanced at the bound man, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. He had tried to kill them, would have succeeded if not for their quick actions, yet the thought of being responsible for sending a man to the gallows was sobering. "He made his choice, Madeline," Wade said gently, reading her expression. "The moment he decided to steal another man's property and take lives to do it, he accepted the consequences." "I know," she sighed. "It's just, I've never been involved in anything like this before." Wade reached across the small fire to take her hand. "You showed remarkable courage today. Not many experienced frontiersmen could have done what you did, let alone a woman new to the territory." Madeline smiled faintly at his praise. "I'm not sure it was courage so much as blind panic. I saw him aiming at you and I just reacted." "That's often when true character reveals itself," Wade observed. "In those moments of crisis when there's no time for deliberation." They lapsed into silence, both contemplating the day's events and their narrow escape. The rustler eventually dozed off, slumping against his bonds, but Madeline found sleep elusive despite her physical exhaustion. "Wade," she said softly, long after the fire had burned down to embers. "What happens when we reach Helena? What happens to us?" In the dim light, she could just make out his features as he considered her question. "That depends," he said finally, "on what you want to happen." "What I want," Madeline repeated thoughtfully. "A month ago, all I wanted was shelter from a blizzard and enough food to survive until spring. Now, Wade prompted when she trailed off. Madeline took a deep breath, gathering her courage. Now I find myself wanting things I never expected, a life in this wild country, purpose, and someone to share it with. Wade was silent for so long that Madeline began to fear she had misread the situation entirely. Then he rose and moved to sit beside her, taking her hands in his. "Madeline," he said, his voice low and earnest, "I've spent 17 years wandering, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. Never allowing myself to care too deeply for anyone or anything that couldn't be packed on a horse at a moment's notice." He paused, his thumbs tracing gentle circles on the backs of her hands. "But these past weeks with you, they've reminded me of what it feels like to have someone worth staying for." Madeline's heart quickened at his words. "What are you saying, Wade?" "I'm saying," he replied slowly, "that if you wanted us, I would find a way to make it work. I have some savings. Enough to buy a small ranch, perhaps, not in Helena necessarily, but somewhere in the territory. You would give up your life as a drover." Madeline asked, scarcely believing what she was hearing. "For me," Wade lifted a hand to cup her cheek. "For us," he corrected gently. "For the chance of building something lasting, something I haven't had since Sarah died." Madeline leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly at the tenderness of the gesture. "We've known each other such a short time," she whispered. "Time enough to know what matters," Wade replied. "I've seen your courage, your resilience, your kindness. I know your heart, Madeline Harris, and it's a heart I could love for a lifetime." Tears welled in Madeline's eyes at his declaration. "And I know yours, Wade Blackwood, a heart steadfast enough to risk everything for a stranger cooking beans over a candle flame." Wade smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Not everything," he said softly, "just 30 head of cattle and a slight detour." Madeline laughed through her tears, and then Wade was kissing her, his lips warm and certain against hers. She returned the kiss with all the emotion that had been building within her since that night in the blizzard-bound cabin. When they finally parted, Wade rested his forehead against hers. "Is that a yes?" he asked, a hint of vulnerability in his voice that touched Madeline deeply. "Yes," she replied without hesitation. "Yes to all of it, to us, to building a life together." They reached Helena late the following afternoon, driving their recovered cattle down the main street to the sheriff's office. Their arrival caused quite a stir. A herd of cattle was common enough, but a cattle drive led by just 2 people. One of them a woman, and with a bound prisoner in tow, was decidedly unusual. The sheriff, a grizzled man named Holbrook, listened to Wade's account of the rustling attempt with professional interest, nodding in approval at Madeline's role in thwarting the attack. "You're a fortunate man, Blackwood," he commented, glancing at Madeline with newfound respect. "Not many ladies would have the presence of mind to act as Miss Harris did." "Believe me, Sheriff, I'm well aware of my good fortune," Wade replied, exchanging a warm look with Madeline that caused the lawman to raise his eyebrows speculatively. After completing the necessary paperwork and arranging for the cattle to be held in the town's stockyard pending the sale Wade had hastily arranged, they secured rooms at the Helena Hotel, separate rooms, of course, though adjacent. "I need to finalize the cattle sale," Wade told Madeline as they stood in the hotel lobby. "And I should send a telegram to Tom, letting him know we've arrived safely in Helena. And I should look for Mr. Collins," Madeline added. "The sooner I understand my situation regarding my uncle's business, the sooner we can make plans." Wade nodded, though a flicker of concern passed across his face. "Would you like me to accompany you?" Madeline smiled, touched by his protective instinct but determined to handle this part of her journey independently. "I'll be fine. This is something I need to do myself." "Very well," Wade agreed. "Shall we meet for dinner this evening, say 7 o'clock in the hotel dining room?" "I look forward to it," Madeline replied, her smile brightening. After freshening up in her room, luxuriating in the novelty of hot water and soap after weeks on the trail, Madeline set out to find her uncle's mercantile. Helena was a busy, prosperous-looking town, its main street lined with substantial buildings of brick and stone rather than the rough wooden structures she had expected. Gold had been discovered in the area some years earlier, she recalled, and the wealth it had brought was evident in the town's architecture and bustling commerce. She found Harris and Collins Mercantile near the center of town, a large, well-maintained establishment with plate glass windows displaying an impressive array of goods. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, Madeline pushed open the door and stepped inside. The store was busy with late-afternoon customers, its shelves stocked with everything from basic provisions to luxury items. A balding, middle-aged man in a neat suit was assisting a customer at the counter. When he finished, Madeline approached him. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm looking for Mr. Collins." The man looked at her with polite interest. "I'm Elias Collins. How may I help you, miss?" Madeline straightened her shoulders. "My name is Madeline Harris. Edwin Harris was my uncle." Collins's expression changed instantly from professional courtesy to genuine shock. "Miss Harris." "But we were informed that all members of Edwin's party had perished. This is remarkable news." "There were 4 survivors initially," Madeline explained. "Myself and a family with a young child. We separated 3 weeks ago. I remained behind to recover my strength while they continued on to Helena. Did they not arrive?" A shadow crossed Collins's face. "No, Miss Harris. No one from your uncle's party has reached Helena to my knowledge." The news of the tragedy came via the telegraph from Fort Benton, based on reports from trappers who found the abandoned wagons. Madeline felt a chill at this news. The family who had traveled on, had they too succumbed to the harsh Montana winter? She said a silent prayer for them, hoping they had found shelter somewhere along the way. "I'm so relieved to see you safe, Miss Harris," Collins continued, genuine warmth in his voice. "Your uncle spoke of you often and with great affection. He was most excited about your coming to join him in the business." "Thank you, Mr. Collins," Madeline replied. I wasn't sure what reception I might find here." Collins looked surprised. "Why ever not? You're Edwin's only living relative and his named heir. Half of this business is rightfully yours." It was Madeline's turn to be shocked. "Half, but I thought my uncle never mentioned. Edwin finalized the papers just before departing to meet your party," Collins explained. "He wanted to surprise you upon your arrival. He was so proud of you, Miss Harris, and determined that you should have a secure future here in Helena." Overwhelmed by this unexpected news, Madeline sank onto a nearby chair that Collins hastily provided. Her uncle, whom she had known primarily through correspondence, had made provisions for her that went far beyond what she could have anticipated. "This changes everything," she murmured, more to herself than to Collins. "Indeed it does," the merchant agreed, misunderstanding her meaning. "You're a woman of considerable property now, Miss Harris. One of Helena's more eligible citizens, if I may be so bold." Madeline smiled faintly, thinking of Wade and their plans. "Mr. Collins, there's something you should know. I've met someone during my journey, a man I intend to marry." Collins's eyebrows rose. "I see, someone from your uncle's party who also survived." "No," Madeline replied. "A cattle drover who found me when I was stranded. He brought me safely to Helena at considerable personal cost." "A drover," Collins repeated, a note of concern entering his voice. "Miss Harris, while I wouldn't presume to interfere in your personal affairs, I feel obliged to caution you against hasty decisions. Your changed circumstances might attract certain types of attention." Madeline understood his implication immediately and felt a flare of indignation. "Mr. Collins, Wade Blackwood saved my life. He diverted his entire cattle drive to escort me to Helena, not knowing anything about my connection to this business or any potential inheritance. His intentions are entirely honorable." Collins held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I meant no offense, Miss Harris. I'm merely concerned for your welfare, as your uncle would have been." "I understand," Madeline said, softening her tone, "and I appreciate your concern, but I assure you Mr. Blackwood is a man of integrity. I trust him implicitly." "Then I look forward to meeting him," Collins replied diplomatically. "In the meantime, there is much to discuss regarding the business. Perhaps you might join me for dinner this evening. There are legal matters to address, and I can bring you up to date on our operations." Madeline hesitated. "I've already made arrangements to dine with Mr. Blackwood tonight. Perhaps tomorrow." Of course, Collins agreed smoothly. Tomorrow would be fine, shall we say noon? We can discuss matters over lunch. That would be perfect, Madeline said, rising to her feet. And Mr. Collins, thank you for your welcome and for honoring my uncle's wishes. It is both my legal obligation and my pleasure, Miss Harris, Collins replied with a slight bow. Edwin was more than a business partner, he was my friend. I am delighted that his niece will continue his legacy in Helena. As Madeline left the mercantile, her mind was awhirl with the implications of what she had learned. She was no longer a destitute orphan dependent on the charity of others. She was a business owner, a woman of means in her own right. The future that had seemed so uncertain just hours before was suddenly full of possibility. She almost collided with Wade as she rounded the corner back to the hotel, so lost in thought that she hadn't seen him approaching. "Madeline," he exclaimed, catching her gently by the shoulders to steady her. "I was just coming to look for you. Is everything all right?" She looked up at him, at the concern in his blue eyes, and felt a surge of love so powerful it nearly took her breath away. This man had risked his life for her, had changed his plans and his future for her, without any thought of personal gain. "Everything is wonderful," she said, linking her arm through his. "Let's go somewhere we can talk. I have the most extraordinary news." They found a small cafe near the hotel, where Madeline related her conversation with Collins over cups of proper tea, a luxury she had sorely missed on the trail. Wade listened attentively, his expression thoughtful. "So you're a wealthy woman now," he said when she had finished. "Half owner of what appears to be a thriving business." "It seems so," Madeline agreed, "though the reality of it hasn't quite sunk in yet." Wade was silent for a moment, turning his cup in his hands. "This changes things," he said finally. Madeline felt a flutter of alarm at his tone. "Changes what exactly?" "Your options," Wade replied. "You no longer need to marry a cattle drover with uncertain prospects. You could have your pick of Helena's most established citizens." "Wade Blackwood," Madeline said, leaning forward to capture his gaze, "if you think for one moment that my uncle's legacy changes anything between us, then you don't know me as well as you claimed last night." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Is that so?" "It is indeed," Madeline affirmed firmly. "I fell in love with you when I had nothing but a candle and a handful of beans to my name. Do you really think a mercantile business would change my heart?" Wade's smile broadened, relief evident in his expression. "I had to be sure," he said simply. "A man doesn't like to think he's being chosen for anything other than himself." "You impossible man," Madeline said with fond exasperation. "I'm choosing you because you saw me at my most vulnerable and treated me with respect, because you risked your life for mine without hesitation. Because when I'm with you, I feel both protected and empowered. No inheritance could possibly compare to that." Wade reached across the table to take her hand. "In that case, Miss Harris, I believe we have plans to make." They were married 2 weeks later in Helena's small Episcopal church, with Elias Collins giving the bride away and Tom, Jack, and Hank, who had arrived from Fort Benton just in time for the ceremony, standing as groomsmen. The entire town turned out for the event, curious to see the new heiress to the Harris Mercantile and her cattle drover husband. Wade had sold his share of the cattle business to his partners, using the proceeds along with his savings to purchase a small ranch 20 miles outside of Helena, close enough for Madeline to remain involved in the mercantile, but with enough land and grazing to satisfy Wade's love of open spaces and livestock. On a warm spring evening 6 months after their wedding, Madeline stood on the porch of their newly built ranch house, watching as Wade rode in from checking the herd. The setting sun gilded his figure, casting long shadows across the meadow that stretched from their door to the distant foothills. As he dismounted and walked toward her, Madeline reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them together. From that desperate night in a blizzard-bound cabin, cooking beans over a candle flame, to this moment of perfect contentment, it seemed almost miraculous. Wade climbed the porch steps and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with the same tender passion that never failed to make her heart race. When they parted, he smiled down at her, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners. "Happy," he asked simply. Madeline laid a hand against his cheek, feeling the day's stubble beneath her palm. "More than I ever dreamed possible," she replied. Then, taking his hand, she placed it gently over her abdomen, where the first slight swell was just becoming noticeable, and soon to be even happier. Wade's expression transformed from confusion to wonder as he understood her meaning. "Madeline," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "Are you certain?" She nodded, tears of joy blurring her vision. "Dr. Miller confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby, Wade." With a whoop of pure joy, Wade lifted her off her feet, spinning her in a circle before setting her carefully back down, suddenly concerned. "Should I not have done that? Are you all right?" Madeline laughed, radiant with happiness. "I'm perfectly fine. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, you know. I'm not made of porcelain." "No," Wade agreed, his eyes soft with love as he gazed at her. "You're made of much stronger stuff, the strongest I've ever known." As the last light of day faded from the sky, they stood together on the porch of the home they had built, looking out over the land that was theirs, anticipating the future that stretched before them, a future bright with promise and possibility. "You ever think about it?" Madeline asked softly. "That night when you found me," Wade nodded, his arm tightening around her waist. "Often, I think about how close we came to missing each other. If we'd taken a different trail, if the storm had pushed us in another direction. If I hadn't been cooking over that candle when you arrived," Madeline added. Wade smiled, remembering. "She was cooking over a candle," he murmured, echoing his words from that first night. "And I said, 'Come where there's fire enough for all,'" Madeline finished for him. "And I did. And that has made all the difference." They stood in comfortable silence for a time, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Then, hand in hand, they turned and went inside, closing the door on the gathering night, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together with fire enough for all. In the years that followed, the Blackwood ranch prospered and grew. Wade's expertise with cattle proved as valuable in ranching as it had in driving, and under his management, their herd increased steadily in both size and quality. Madeline divided her time between the ranch and the mercantile in Helena, where she introduced innovations that expanded the business well beyond what her uncle and Collins had envisioned. Their daughter, Sarah Elizabeth Blackwood, was born on a snowy December night, almost exactly a year after their wedding. She had her father's blue eyes and her mother's determination, and from the moment she could walk, she followed Wade everywhere, absorbing his knowledge of horses and cattle with an eagerness that delighted him. 2 years later, a son joined their family, William Edwin Blackwood, named for both Wade's father and Madeline's uncle. Unlike his adventurous sister, William was a thoughtful, quiet child who preferred books to horses and showed an early aptitude for figures that suggested he might one day take over the mercantile aspect of the family's enterprises. As their children grew, so too did the community around them. Other ranchers and farmers settled in the area, drawn by the fertile valley and the proximity to Helena's markets. Wade and Madeline's home became a natural gathering place, known for its warm hospitality and Madeline's unfailing willingness to help neighbors in need. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Wade surprised Madeline with a gift that brought tears to her eyes: a small silver candle holder, exquisitely crafted by a silversmith in Helena, with their initials and the date of their first meeting engraved on the base. "To remind us," he said as she unwrapped it, "of where our story began." Madeline placed the candle holder in the center of their dining table, where it remained as a constant symbol of their journey together from that desperate night in a blizzard-bound cabin to the rich, full life they had built. 20 years passed, bringing changes both expected and unforeseen. Sarah, as adventurous and independent as both her parents, married a young rancher from a neighboring property, combining their lands to create one of the largest cattle operations in the area. William, true to his early inclinations, took over management of the mercantile when Elias Collins retired, expanding it into a department store that rivaled those in much larger cities. And Wade and Madeline, their hair now streaked with silver but their love undiminished by the passing years, continued to work side by side, partners in all things. On a warm summer evening, as they sat on the porch of their ranch house watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple, Wade took Madeline's hand, his fingers interlacing with hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over their years together. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked suddenly. "Choosing this life, choosing me?" Madeline turned to him in surprise. "Regret? Why would you ask such a thing after all these years?" Wade shrugged slightly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You could have had an easier life. Stayed in Helena, run the mercantile, married someone, more civilized." Madeline laughed, the sound as clear and joyful as it had been when they first met. "Wade Blackwood, you impossible man. After 30 years, you still don't understand, do you?" He looked at her then, his blue eyes as compelling as they had been that first night by the firelight. "Understand what?" "That I never wanted easy," Madeline said simply. "I wanted real, I wanted true, I wanted you." Wade smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening with the expression that still made her heart skip a beat after all their years together. "And I wanted you," he replied softly. "From the moment I saw you, so determined to survive against all odds, cooking those beans over that little candle flame." "She was cooking over a candle," Madeline quoted, her voice warm with the memory. "And the cowboy said, 'Come where there's fire enough for all,'" Wade finished. "The best invitation I ever extended." "And the best one I ever accepted," Madeline agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder as the last light of day faded from the sky. As stars began to appear in the darkening heavens, they sat together in the comfortable silence of two people who had shared a lifetime of words and no longer needed them to communicate what mattered most. Behind them, lights glowed in the windows of the home they had built, a beacon of warmth and welcome in the vast Montana landscape. Before them stretched the ranch that had grown and prospered under their care, a legacy for their children and grandchildren. And between them, as it had been from the beginning, burned the steady flame of a love kindled in the most unlikely of circumstances, a love that had indeed proved to be fire enough for all.